As the governor of Bombay looked out over the vast expanse of the Arabian Sea, his thoughts couldn't help but be consumed by visions of paradise. Fresh off a successful campaign in World War I, where he'd served with legends like Lawrence of Arabia and had received numerous promotions and awards for his leadership, Sir Lloyd had been given the exalted position at the head of one of India's wealthiest provinces, the greatest trading powerhouse east of London, the jewel of British India. But despite ruling over a city of more than 1.2 million souls, an industrial complex of mills and factories and busy ports, Sir Lloyd was not satisfied. He wanted more. More land to construct towering monuments to British colonial power, more space to build wide roads and exclusive neighborhoods where the Bombay elite would not have to suffer sharing space with the dirty, overcrowded slums filled with laborers. Sir George Lloyd wanted to conquer the ocean herself, reclaiming land for the city of Bombay. Even as his boots sank into the marshy, untamed mud of the Back Bay, his plans were already underway. The designs were drawn up, the machinery had been ordered, and a hefty budget of nearly 4 crore rupees had been allocated for the project. It was all coming together. Soon, the far-reaching power of the British Empire would be obvious to all those who visited this entirely man-made part of the city. They would pave over nature with technology and industrialize these primitive Orientals whether they liked it or not. But unbeknownst to him, there was trouble brewing beneath his very nose. A problem so large that it would expose the lofty ideologies of Western supremacists as a great farce and would leave his plans for a utopian neighborhood resurrected from the ocean a broken dream for decades to come. Join me as we step through the complete history of Mumbai, from its origins as an ancient trading outpost to the present-day metropolis teeming with life, infested with crime, and brimming with opportunity. If you step out onto the platform at Nala Sopara railway station and look around, you won't really find much of interest. This is far from the megacity of Mumbai, a quiet satellite town by the Arabian Sea with some neighborhoods and a beach. But 2,500 years ago, you would be standing in the midst of one of the most important ports in Western India. Just imagine a sprawling township all along the coast, hundreds of ships parked at the docks waiting for their cargo to be unloaded. You'd see shipments of ceramics and glass from Mesopotamia, pottery and linen from Egypt, resins and perfumes from Arabia, and exotic animal products like rhinoceros horn and tortoise shell from East Africa. In exchange, the merchants of Sopara would be exporting tons of ivory, textile, gemstones, sandalwood, and other luxury products. You'd hear 100 different languages from various continents here, and wealth flowed through this region like water. It was no wonder then that Sopara was a coveted trading hub, catching the eye of many an ancient Indian king. Ashoka Maurya was one of the first rulers to cast his gaze westward, capturing Sopara in the 3rd century BCE. It was his influence that saw a new religion gain a foothold in the region: Buddhism. Today, you will still find the ruins of a Buddhist stupa in Sopara, little more than an overgrown mound of bricks and mud. But back then, Buddhists would have populated the area, establishing safe houses for travelers and merchants to rest, and spreading the word of the Buddha to all who had a mind for it. Rock-cut cave temples at the Kanheri and Mahakali caves still exist today, where you can get a taste of the aesthetics and somber devotion of the Buddhist scholars who visited this place for pilgrimage or education. Over the centuries, many empires rose and fell across north and central India, but the desire of these kings, whether ancient or medieval, for a powerful port city never diminished. Whether it was the Satavahanas, the Kalachuris, the Chalukyas, or the Rashtrakutas, Indian kings were willing to go to any lengths to acquire a direct connection to international trading networks. If you think Mumbai today is a cosmopolitan melting pot of regional and global cultures, inviting artists and businessmen and politicians to join the chaos that churns within, that's because it's been this way for the last 3,000 years. By the time the Portuguese arrived in 1509, the islands of Bombay were under the control of the Gujarat Sultan, Bahadur Shah. The foreigners were looking to secure control of the spice trade in India and Africa, but the Portuguese viceroy, Francisco de Almeida, had already been kicked out of Calicut after he tried to attack them. He then decided to try his luck at the next best spot, the islands of Bombay, where he managed to defeat a fleet of Egyptian and Ottoman vessels. These were their main competitors in international trade, so Francisco had just secured Portugal's place in the spice trade with a bit of targeted violence. Over the next couple of decades, the Portuguese would repeatedly attack and raid the Bombay region, causing no small amount of grief to the Sultan of Gujarat. Things really took a turn when they captured the Vasai fort, establishing their own stronghold on the west coast. But as bad as the Portuguese were, they were far from the biggest problem the Sultan had. Slowly advancing from the north were the inexorable armies of the Mughals under Humayun, and the Sultan was desperate for allies to help him fight off the invaders. A light bulb went off in his head, and instead of fighting two wars at once, he decided to sign the Treaty of Bassein with the Portuguese, offering them the islands of Bombay in exchange for their help in defeating the Mughal forces. Now, I've been calling it the Islands of Bombay this whole time, and there's a reason for that. At this point in history, Bombay, at least the part of it comprising the old city of Kolaba, Mahim, Worli, Parel and the surrounding areas, was not a single contiguous piece of land. What looks like this today actually looked like this just 300 years ago. Bombay was a collection of 7 tiny islands, populated mostly by fishermen and traders living in a handful of small towns and villages, and not much else. The geography of this place was rather unstable, where a lot of the terrain was wet and marshy, full of mangrove forests and tidal flats. The water was shallow enough in some places that during low tide, you could actually walk between some of the islands, but the rest of it was completely submerged. Just walk around south and central Mumbai, down Grant Road or through Baikalla or Chor Bazaar, and just imagine everything under 100 feet of water. Sorry, too soon? Anyway, that's what it would have been like in the 1600s. The islands wouldn't be united for another 300 years once the British began to realize the commercial potential of the Bombay port, and it's a wildly fascinating story of political corruption, Indian nationalism, and colonial hubris. Don't worry, we'll get to that later in this video. But for now, Bombay was firmly in the grasp of the Portuguese, who were enamored by the bucolic landscape and the refreshing salty sea breeze. Here was an island, as if floating on water in the midst of a beautiful group of islands, not peopled perhaps by the nymphs, the nereids and naiads, but by winsome coolies of the Negrito type, with the sea all around and rivers, springs, trees and mountains in the adjacent islands. This romantic picture of the islands was reflected in the Lusiads, a Portuguese epic poem that was likely inspired by life on the islands. But while life was good for the Portuguese residents of Bombay, things weren't looking so rosy for the native inhabitants. These new foreign lands were ripe for conversion by Catholic missionaries, who took up the task with gusto. They fanned out across the islands, destroying mosques and temples and building churches in their place. They forcefully converted the natives and sparked religious tensions by planting crosses near rivers and lakes where Brahmins bathed. Meanwhile, the Portuguese were making good use of their exclusive access to the Indian spice trade, currently the only European power to have this advantage. This, however, would be a short-lived victory because in 1580, the King of Spain invaded his neighbor and claimed the Portuguese throne for himself. With the empire and its colonies thrown into disarray, the opportunity was ripe for new colonial powers to enter the fray. This is how the Dutch, and more importantly, the British East India companies gained entry into India. The new competition brought in fresh conflict, and before long, the Dutch, Portuguese and British were fighting wars, signing trade agreements with different kingdoms and expanding their commercial operations in India. Fearing that the Dutch would overtake them, the British were eager to take possession of Bombay from the Portuguese. In 1661, a marriage treaty of the British King Charles II with the Portuguese Princess Catherine of Braganza cemented this deal, and the semi-urban settlement of Bombay was handed over to the British as dowry. The stage was now set for a brand new phase of the city's history, now ruled by an upstart colonial power that had grand ambitions in the country. Of course, at the time, no one could have foreseen the implications of this one political maneuver. Bombay was merely a bargaining chip in a marriage alliance between two foreign powers, neither of whom realized how it would shape the course of world history forever. The British had initially been interested in Bombay as a naval base to dock their warships, but it would soon grow to assume a different role. As tensions between the Marathas and the British made their headquarters at Surat too difficult to defend, the East India Company shifted operations to Bombay, where they built solid fortifications, a marine force to defend the dockyard, and a church for the Europeans. Now they had to establish Bombay as a commercial center, taking advantage of its access to the open ocean. The EIC used its trading connections in Gujarat to invite merchants to their new port city. Back in Surat, the small but powerful community of Parsis had close ties to the company, acting as interpreters, agents, and shipbuilders for the Europeans. They were among the first to set up shop in Bombay in the late 17th century, but they were also joined by Jain and Hindu merchants of the Baniya caste and Muslims of the Bohra, Khoja, and Memon communities. But there was a problem. Sure, the Bombay Islands belonged to the British now, but anywhere north of this, and you were back in Portuguese territory, and these people were trying their best to make life harder for the British by refusing to trade in food and essential goods with them. To make matters worse, the Marathas had acquired parts of the neighboring mainland from the Mughals, what would today be Navi Mumbai and beyond. The islands were too small for large-scale agriculture, and importing food from the Malabar coast would be too expensive in the long run, especially if they wanted to invite a large immigrant population. So they were surrounded by hostile enemies on the right and an ocean on the left. But hold on, what if they could make the ocean go away? The British had just struck upon an idea that would change the very geography of Bombay forever: reclamation. The plan was to dig up thousands of tons of mud from a suitable location, then use that mud to build tall embankments that would keep out the seawater. They could then dig channels to drain the shallow lagoon in the center and empty out the whole region in between the islands, effectively turning ocean into usable land. Of course, this was way easier said than done. It took more than 20 years for the idea to actually go from blueprint to reality, and even then it wasn't really all that successful. The reclamation project cost several lakh rupees in the 1720s, which is who knows how many hundreds of crores today. And the agricultural output of the land did not justify the cost. But you gotta give it to them, the British were determined bastards. So they continued to invest in the city as a trading town, inviting immigrants from all the neighboring regions and even from places like Madagascar. Now that the Marathas had captured Salsette from the Portuguese, the British were able to expand their city further north, even signing a peace treaty with the Marathas in exchange for their help defeating Hyder Ali of Mysore. Yet another round of reclamations took place in 1782, the Hornby-Vellard project, uniting all 7 islands into a single landmass. Places like Mahalakshmi and Kamatipura, which were low-lying marshy areas half underwater, became usable land after this project. Today, one of those neighborhoods is a posh, upscale locality full of high-rise apartments, while the other a dirty, crowded red light district built on the abuse and exploitation of poor women. But if you went there just 200 years ago, you wouldn't have been able to tell them apart. The early 19th century saw the British go from strength to strength, not just in Bombay, but the surrounding areas as well. The defeat of the Marathas in 1818 was like a shot of steroids for the East India Company, who now suddenly had control over huge parts of Central Asia. At this point in time, the British were selling enormous quantities of opium to China in exchange for tea, using their colony in Bengal as the base of manufacturing and shipping. But rampant opium addiction in China meant that demand was outstripping supply. The timing could not have been better. Enterprising Indian merchants began growing opium in the Malwa region in modern-day Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh. Thousands of crates filled with the intoxicating brown powder were now being transported to Bombay warehouses, being loaded onto ships in the Bombay docks, and bringing money pouring into the pockets of Bombay merchants. The East India Company was not happy at this challenge to their opium monopoly and tried to outlaw the export of the drug in the Bombay Presidency. But the Indian traders had gotten a taste for the massive profits to be had in opium and took to smuggling and skirting the law wherever they could. By the 1820s, Bombay's trade revenues from China had surpassed that of its longtime rival, Calcutta. As distasteful as it seems now, the opium trade was what initially fueled the growth of Bombay, bringing in immense capital and allowing all sorts of industries to be set up in the city, which further enticed artisans, construction workers, and laborers to flock to the city in astonishing numbers. Some of the richest men in Bombay at the time had built their fortunes on opium, and these were the people contributing to the city's growing infrastructure. Few people today know that renowned institutions like JJ School of Art or JJ Hospital, which were named after Jamsetji JG Boy, were established using money obtained from drug trafficking. But even the powerful opium lords of Bombay couldn't keep up with the East India Company, who were able to leverage the established trade networks of the British Empire to regain a competitive advantage. By the mid-19th century, the ever-resourceful Bombay merchants were shifting their attention to a different type of export: cotton. Parsi merchants had already been selling cotton to England for some years, but they were now faced with a problem. The cotton mills in Lancashire preferred the long-stapled cotton coming out of the United States compared to the short-stapled Indian variety. Things weren't looking so good for the merchants of Bombay, until Lady Luck smiled on them once more. On the other side of the world, the United States was suddenly plunged into turmoil as a bloody civil war gripped the country. In order to weaken the Confederate States, whose chief source of revenue was cotton, President Abraham Lincoln used his navy to blockade the ports of New Orleans and Mississippi. Overnight, the cotton mills of Lancashire were left with no supply of American cotton, and they couldn't exactly afford to wait around for the war to end. If the mills weren't making money, they were losing it. How convenient then that Bombay just happened to have warehouses full of cotton waiting to be sold. The mills of Lancashire were back in action, this time using Indian cotton to feed the British Empire's insatiable appetite for cheap new textiles. At the peak of the cotton boom, you'd be able to walk through entire fields of cotton bales bigger than a full-grown man, stacked 15 or 20 feet high so they looked like the walls of some great fortress. Laborers would be toiling in the humid Bombay sun, while cotton traders would walk by with their logbooks, casting shrewd eyes over their inventory before it was shipped off to some distant port. The newly minted cotton merchants of Bombay were like the kings of the city. One prominent businessman, Premchand Roychand, known as the Cotton King, used his fortunes to establish the Bombay Stock Exchange in 1875, which today has a market capitalization of over $5 trillion. Now, the money was coming in, sure, but something else was not. Food. The traders who were exporting cotton overseas were up to their necks in orders for fresh cotton, and they were receiving real-time updates on the market rates of cotton from the US and Britain via telegraph. This meant they were often staying up all night fulfilling orders, and they couldn't exactly ask their wives to cook for them at 2 in the morning. They needed a quick and easy meal, something that wasn't elaborate or needed a ton of specialized ingredients. Luckily, the nearby street vendors were quick to adapt. They mashed up some leftover vegetables, cooked it in a spicy tomato gravy, and served it with a small loaf of bread that the Portuguese used to make, the pau. And so, the unwitting confluence of a hungry cotton market in England, a civil war halfway around the planet, and the ever-reliable jugaad of the Indian street vendor gave birth to one of the most iconic and quintessentially Bombay delicacies, the pav bhaji. Of course, the boom of the cotton exports wouldn't last forever, and as soon as the American Civil War came to an end in 1865, cotton prices fell dramatically. It once more fell upon the industrious businessmen of Bombay to adapt to the circumstances, which they now did by opening up cotton mills. These highly labor-intensive factories would produce large quantities of yarn and textile, which would be exported all around the world, and particularly to China. The city was now witness to yet another wave of migrant workers, pouring in by the thousands and occupying increasingly crowded and unsanitary neighborhoods. By the 1870s, cotton mills were employing over 28% of the labor force in the city as daily wage workers, most of whom were living in the infamous tenements known as chawls. Built by the mill owners or greedy private builders, these were dingy, poorly ventilated buildings that cynically maximized the space they were built on. 5 to 10 people would typically share a room no larger than 60 square feet, and several dozen residents would have to share a common toilet. Any available space, including verandas, was rented out to desperate immigrants. These structures were so cheaply constructed with low quality wood and materials that residents had to be evacuated to a new space every few years before the building could collapse from sheer neglect. One Scottish urban planner even remarked that the chawls were not for housing, but warehousing people. It was mostly men who migrated to Bombay from far-off villages, leaving their families behind, hoping to find someone from their village to agree to squeeze them into an already overstuffed chawl room and, with any luck, get them some work in a nearby factory. The ones who weren't so lucky were relegated to the streets, where they could perhaps find a corrugated tin roof over their heads or build primitive mud huts in a space no one else wanted. It's not that the government didn't notice this. Colonial officials reported on the squalor and filth that these human beings were living in and saw the atrocious quality of facilities afforded to them. What they somehow didn't see was how these inhuman conditions were a direct result of the unchecked capitalism encouraged by the colonial government, their complete lack of accountability for the suffering caused by placing profits over basic human rights. No laws had been passed to regulate the exploitation of these poor workers, since it was far more convenient to see them as a subhuman labor force whose presence, while undesirable, was nevertheless necessary for the factories to keep on humming along. The bleak reality is, in the nearly 80 years since the British left India, these chawls and slums are as prevalent in modern Mumbai as they've ever been, and they're not going away anytime soon. As the majority of the city's population was slaving away in cramped factories, creating wealth for the Bombay elite, the city was expanding like never before. A fresh round of land reclamations had increased Bombay's land area by more than 10 square kilometers, and the government set about developing these brand new open spaces. Roads were paved over what was once marshy wetland, and the land buzzed with construction activity. Through the mid-19th century, Bombay's skyline would be dominated with imposing stone and brick buildings in the ornate Gothic style. The goal was clear. The unruly colonial city had to be gentrified, made into a proper European city that could be shown off to the world as a shining beacon of British imperialism. Because now that the British Empire had taken over the colonies from the East India Company, Bombay had to reflect the qualities of the empire. Buildings like the Secretariat, the High Court, the Public Works Office, and the Victoria Terminus were to be a symbol of imperial dominance, looming over the city, quietly representing the permanence of a distant power whose reach extended all around the world. But all this was just a facade, because at the street level, Bombay was still as chaotically cosmopolitan and as delightfully uncouth and irreverent as it is today. Walk through the streets and you would move among dazzling tides of humans rolling through the city streets every morning, of Memon and Khoja women in green and gold, or pink and yellow kurta and izzar, strolling with their children dressed in all hues of the rainbow. Sleek Hindus from northern India in soft muslin and neat coloured turbans, Gujaratis in red headgear, Kutchi seafarers, descendants of the pirates of dead centuries, rich black-coated Persian merchants, picturesque full-bearded Maulvis, smart sepoys from Hindustan, gold-turbaned and shrewd-eyed Memon traders, ruddy jats from the Multan, high-cheeked Siddhis, heavily dressed Bukharas, Arabs, Afghans, and pallid embroiderers from Surat. Then there are mill hands returning from their daily labor, merchants going home, beggars, hawkers, fruit sellers, and sweetmeat sellers milling about, crowds entering shops, and groups on the thresholds of coffee vendors. Bombay was a living thing, growing, metastasizing, choked with smoke from factories and opium dens, chattering with the sound of lively markets selling anything a man was willing to part with, and much besides. But the problem with having so many people from different parts of the country in one place is that no one eats the same type of food. And in the 1890s, you didn't exactly have a ton of restaurants to choose from. Unsatisfied with what was available nearby, a Parsi banker wanted home-cooked food delivered to his office every day. The idea caught on as more and more people hired their own delivery boys to bring fresh homemade tiffins to their offices, until a businessman, Mahadev Havji Bachche, started a tiffin delivery service with 100 delivery men known as the Dabbawalas. Today, Mumbai's Dabbawalas deliver over 3 lakh lunches every single day to offices across the city with an astonishing error rate of only 0.0001%. Now, the thing about a rapidly expanding urban settlement, a haven for free markets, and a melting pot of cultures, religions, and races is that it's bound to attract the sort of free-thinking, rebellious minds that desire to shake up the status quo, the type of people detested by those in power. By the 1880s, Bombay was swiftly becoming a hotbed of political activism and anti-colonial nationalism. On 28 December 1885, a delegation of 72 men who would go on to be freedom fighters, including Dadabhai Nauroji, Subramanya Iyer, and Romesh Chandra Dutt, met at the Gokuldas Tejpal Sanskrit College in Bombay to form the Indian National Congress. The political atmosphere in the city was growing tense with each passing year, as more and more educated Indians found themselves deeply unsatisfied by the inequities they had to endure under their colonial overlords. Protests against the British came in various forms, but none more enduring than the famous Ganesh Chaturthi celebrations of Bombay. In a brilliantly far-sighted move that would allow Indian nationalists to rally the public to their cause without arousing the ire of the British, Bal Gangadhar Tilak organized an elaborate 10-day event in 1892 where idols were paraded through the streets of Bombay and Pune and devotees danced to loud music. They used this opportunity to gather in large numbers, interact with one another, and spread ideas without the pall of British surveillance hanging over them. In the decades since independence, the Ganesh Chaturthi celebrations in Mumbai have grown in scale and fervor, a spectacle of colour, music, and dance enjoyed by lakhs of devotees. But in the poor quarters of the city, decades of neglect from the government were to finally bring a reckoning as Bombay crumpled under the terrible weight of the Bubonic Plague in 1896. The slums and chawls that the rich mill owners were content to let their workers live in suddenly became a seething hotbed of disease and infection. As the plague spread in the rat-infested hovels, people began dying in alarming numbers. In the last 3 months of the year, over 1,500 people died every single week. Workers began rioting and attacking hospitals, but nothing could contain the panic on the streets as people began fleeing en masse, crowding the railway stations to escape. The exodus had emptied out nearly half the city. 4 lakh people had vanished practically overnight. The plague served as a rude wake-up call for the Bombay municipal authorities, who were forced to shift their focus to the poorer class of society for once. They began constructing more roads, expanded the rail network to transport workers to factories, plantations, and mills. Sanitation facilities were improved, neighborhoods were decongested, and housing was upgraded. Slowly but surely, the city began to return to normal. But Bombay was not the sort of city to stay idle for very long, especially as a great war was brewing in Europe. As Britain was plunged into World War I, it called on its colonies to provide support and resources. Bombay was a major contributor, providing the empire with food supplies, cotton and textiles, jute, mineral and ores, and vegetable oil. Over 1 million Indian soldiers served in the war, many of whom were shipped off from Bombay. The sudden demand for manpower resulted in an influx of immigrants to the city, sending land prices soaring. Now here was an opportunity just waiting to be exploited. Remember Sir George Lloyd, the governor of Bombay? Well, he was currently eyeing the southernmost end of the island, the patch of ocean known as the Back Bay. But what if he could reclaim some of that land in the area, say about 1,000 acres? With the land prices the highest they'd ever been, the Bombay government could make a tidy profit selling off that land to the highest bidders. And what's more, they could use the excuse that it was for the public good, since more land meant more space for the growing population of the city. It was the perfect plan, totally foolproof. He hired a civil engineer, George Buchanan, to oversee the project, perform the necessary field tests, and purchase the expensive equipment needed. There was breathless excitement among the government officials, visions of the boundless potential of human engineering to subdue nature and build a cityscape symbolizing the empire's greatness. Everything was going according to plan. Until the project ground to a halt. And I mean that literally. Turns out, through some comical levels of incompetence and negligence, the head engineer had completely failed to test the soil in the area they were supposed to dig up, so the costly machine they purchased was running at less than half the calculated efficiency. Within a year of its approval, the project's budget was revised from 3.7 crore rupees to 7 crores, almost double. What was supposed to take just a few years now seemed like it was decades away from completion. And the once beautiful ocean front of the Back Bay was now a dystopian mess of construction equipment, mountains of mud, and squandered taxpayer money. The Bombay public was understandably incensed, but no one more so than Khurshid Framji Nariman, a Parsi lawyer who had been observing the government's failures with mounting rage. He launched a fiery campaign against the governor and his cronies, writing columns in the newspaper, speaking to the public about the government's vandalism of the Back Bay, and gathering support for his cause. The government's big mistake was trying to silence him with a defamation lawsuit. Nariman fired back with a volley of razor-sharp accusations, each backed up by evidence of the government's mismanagement of funds, corrupt dealings with high officials, and lies told to the public. On 27 January 1928, K.F. Nariman was cleared of all libel charges by the presidency magistrate, making him a hero in the eyes of the Bombay public. The Back Bay Bungle, as it was called, was a truly dark patch in the city's history of land reclamation. Nevertheless, what little land was reclaimed from the failed project gave rise to one of Mumbai's most famous and beloved landmarks, the bejeweled Marine Drive, sweeping in a southward arc through the Back Bay, inviting the refreshing ocean spray as it crashes against the concrete tetrapods along the sea wall. And at its very tip, the aptly named downtown area of Nariman Point, where thousands of professionals arrive to work in glitzy high-rises with a view of the sea. Bombay of the 1930s would have been an exciting place to be. The air was electric with intellectual discourse and political revolution. Bombay was one of the centers of the civil disobedience movement, with prominent freedom fighters like Mahatma Gandhi and Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel organizing mass protests and boycotts. The Congress also solidified itself as a bona fide political party, gaining a majority in the Bombay Legislative Assembly. It wasn't just political activists who were flocking to the city, but artists too, drawn by the promise of the emerging new art form that had taken the city by storm: cinema. By now, the Indian film industry was producing 200 movies a year, and Hindi was the language of choice for Bombay filmmakers. Actors, writers, and songwriters flocked to the newly established studios to tell glittering stories full of song, drama, and romance. The city was getting a facelift too, with the introduction of Art Deco architecture, leaving behind the Baroque stylings of Gothic buildings for a more modern aesthetic that reflected the power of industry and technology. Marine Drive in particular was transformed, with new buildings popping up regularly. As the country grew ever more belligerent against the colonial government in the 1940s, Bombay was steeped in political fervor, and the Indian identity was growing stronger than ever. Bollywood films shifted from fantastical themes of drama and romance to contemporary stories of nationalism and class divisions in an unequal society. Bombay was also becoming the financial hub of the country, attracting businesses and investors to the city in droves. Equally, Bombay became a hub of violence in the lead up to independence, as the slightest provocation sparked communal riots between Hindus and Muslims. The city's massive population of Muslims were torn between two worlds after the India-Pakistan partition, and many were left wondering whether to leave or stay behind. It's difficult to say how many, but perhaps a lakh or more Bombay residents left for places like Lahore and Karachi. On the 28th of February 1948, the last battalion of British troops left the city, passing under the gateway of India one final time before boarding their ships back to England, ending 282 years of British rule in Bombay. In the 78 years since independence, Bombay has become Mumbai, has transformed in more ways than one. As the city grew faster and more recklessly through the mid-20th century, further reclamations were planned, particularly in the south. But in a cruel irony, the new land that was reclaimed in the 1960s and 70s at Nariman Point was quietly given off to private builders instead of being publicly auctioned, prompting accusations of corruption. It seems that no man's legacy is safe in the city of dreams. New political movements swept the metropolis over the years, but none more influential than the Hindu nationalist Shiv Sena political party, taking a strongly pro-Marathi stance in defiance of Bombay's cultural and linguistic plurality. In doing so, the party's leader, Bal Thackeray, appealed to Maharashtrians to be entrepreneurs, set up their own businesses and restaurants the way Kannadigas had proliferated Udupi restaurants. Inspired by this rhetoric, Ashok Vaidya decided to open his own food stall, selling a simple yet innovative snack that's made for the busy Bombay life. A deep fried potato dumpling squished in between a pav bun with some spicy chutneys to go with it. The Vada Pav was an instant hit, portable, not messy, and easy to eat while hurrying to work down a crowded street. A few years later, when the textile mills of Bombay began closing en masse during the 1970s, thousands of unemployed mill workers caught the entrepreneurial spirit, opening up their own Vada Pav stalls around the city. Overnight, the humble potato and bread snack had become the banner under which millions of Mumbaikars professed their love for their city, their home. Even if you've never been to Mumbai, you've definitely seen it in 1,000 films, heard of its iconic landmarks, sensed the pulse of the city wherever you are in India. It's a city that refuses to be ignored, scoffs at the notion of standing still even for a moment, and beckons you to its glamorous streets without even needing to ask. It's a city that has weathered the onslaught of nature, fought back against the violence of terrorism, and stood against the greed of capitalism without losing its humanity. Thank you so much for watching this video on the history of Mumbai. There's so much more I wish I could have included in this video, but that's basically impossible. So I'd love it if you could share your stories about Mumbai's history with me in the comments. Mumbai Fables by Gyan Prakash was a major source of research for this video. You should definitely check it out. It's not really a history book, but more of a collection of interesting stories that shaped the city you see today. Until next time, see you soon!